When therefore you shall see the abomination of desolation, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him who reads understand. Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of the end times. This is part 3 in my series in which I am unsealing the abomination of desolation as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And we found out in the first 2 parts that there are actually 4 abominations of desolation. And each abomination refers to a different group. They affect 4 different groups in different ways. And we saw that in chapters 10 and 12, it is the Catholics who are affected first. And on this program, I want to look at the holy martyrs, because they are affected last. And we find them in chapter 8 of the great prophet Daniel. First, let's review where we find these 4 groups who will reign with Jesus during the millennium in the book of Revelation. Now, we've already seen where Jesus describes them in Matthew 24 and where Daniel describes them in chapter number 12. And in the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 21, which are the end time chapters, John uses the term blessed 4 times. And each time he is referring to one of these 4 groups. Let's look at chapter 14, verse 13. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Now, of course, that refers to the martyrs, which is the subject of this program. Revelation 16, verse 15. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garments. Now, that refers to the protected Catholics. Watching, in this case, means praying the Rosary. The garments that they wear refer to Mary's scapular. And in chapter 19, verse 9, we find the raptured Protestants. Blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And chapter 20, verse 6, blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. Now, this group refers to the converted Jews. On such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Now, when John says they will be priests of God and Christ refers to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So now we come to Daniel chapter number 8, which is a prophecy of how the abomination of desolation will affect the holy martyrs. And we are going to find that once again, Daniel says that it is Mary's rosary which will defeat the Antichrist. And he reveals this through the hidden structure, in very much the same way as he did in chapters 10 and 12. This is how the angel told Daniel to seal up his prophecies until the end times. Now in chapters 10 and 12, we found that the chief protagonist was the false prophet. And that's because that it affected the Catholics. And that abomination of desolation comes first. Now this abomination of desolation, which affects the holy martyrs, comes last, approximately 6 months after the false prophet takes over the Catholic Church. So how do we know that Daniel is talking about the martyrs in chapter number 8? Let's take a look at verse number 25. And in the abundance of all things, he shall kill many. So the Antichrist is described here by Daniel as a killer. And in verse 24, and he shall destroy the mighty and the people of the saints. Now, the Antichrist is described in many places in Scripture as the man of sin, as the lawless one, but I can't think of any other place where he is actually described as a killer. And that's why I believe in chapter number 8, the Antichrist is the abomination of desolation. In chapter number 8, Daniel writes more about the Antichrist than he does in any of his other chapters. That's why I believe that for the holy martyrs, the abomination of desolation will be the Antichrist. Just as we found out that in chapters 10 and 12, for the protected Catholics, the abomination of desolation would be the false prophet. Here in chapter number 8, Daniel writes about the Antichrist in almost 1/3 of the verses, starting in verse number 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, and it became great against the south and against the east and against the strength. Now I believe this indicates the general geographical area that the Antichrist will come from, and I believe that is Western Turkey, probably Istanbul, but also possibly Pergamum. Now verse number 10. And it was magnified even to the strength of heaven. Now the strength of heaven would be Jesus. And it threw down of the strength and of the stars and trod upon them. Now the stars would be the clergy. And this refers to the trotting down of the Catholic Church, as we also see in Revelation chapter number 11. Verse 11, and it was magnified even to the prince of the strength. That would be Jesus. And it took away from him the continual sacrifice. The continual sacrifice is the Holy Eucharist. And I don't believe that changes for the martyrs. And cast down the place of his sanctuary. That would be the church. Verse 12, and strength was given him against the continual sacrifice because of sins. And truth shall be cast down on the ground. And he shall do and shall prosper. Now, I will explain in a few minutes why I have continual sacrifice and strength underlined. Of course, we should really not be surprised that the Antichrist will cause many of us to suffer martyrdom. Jesus himself told us that no servant is greater than his master. And Jesus died a horrible death on the cross through crucifixion. Why should we be any better than our Lord and Master? And whereas Daniel tells us that Mary's Rosary will defeat the Antichrist, that does not guarantee that we will not die at the hands of the Antichrist. Now, Daniel tells us that Mary's Rosary will be ultimately victorious in chapter number 8, in very much the same way as he did in chapters number 10 and 12, and that is through a chiasmus structure. This is the hidden structure that the angel tells Daniel to seal up his prophecies until the end times. Now in chapter number 8, there are 27 verses, which is an odd number. Therefore, to split the chapter exactly in half, you will have to put 13 verses on one side, 13 verses on the other, and a bridge verse, which is verse number 14, right in the middle. In other words, verses 1 through 13 are on the left, verses 15 through 27 in reverse order are on the right, and the bridge verse number 14 I show here at the bottom middle. Let's take a look at how Daniel verifies that this is the correct way to read and understand the abomination of desolation as described in chapter number 8. Now here, Daniel organizes his chiasmus in a slightly different fashion. In chapter 10 and 12, he indicated a relationship between verses by repeating the subject matter. Here in verse number 8, Daniel repeats a certain word or phrase. For example, we know verse number 1 is related to verse 27 because he repeats the word vision once. And we know that verse number 2 is related to verse number 26 because he repeats the same word, vision, twice. So this particular combination occurs only when you set up these verses in this particular chiasmus. And we see a similar pattern in the last 3 verses on each side of this chiasmus. And not that the words repeat from one side to the other, but there are 3 words that repeat within these last 3 verses. In this case, verse 11, 12, and 13 all contain the word continual sacrifice. And nowhere else in chapter number 8 is that phrase found. And in verses 17, 16, and 15, the word is vision, which is repeated in all 3 of these verses. The same word that is found in the first 2 verses and the last 2 verses of this chiasmus. And now let's take a look at this hinge verse or bridge verse, and that is verse number 14, because it is extremely important, and that's why it is located in this particular position. Starting in verse 13, "And I heard one of the saints speaking, and one saint said to another, I know not to whom that was speaking, How long shall be the vision concerning the continual sacrifice, and the sin of desolation that is made, and the sanctuary and the strength be trodden under foot?" Now this time, the continual sacrifice taken away, and the strength trodden under foot refers to when the holy martyrs have to take notice. And in verse number 14, "And he said unto him, unto evening and morning, 2,300 days, and the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Now this 2,300 evening and mornings actually works out to 1,150 days, which is the shortest time given in all of the chapters which refer to the abomination of desolation. And of course, again, this is a symbolic number. It's not meant to be exact. Notice this number, 23. We know that this is the number of the Antichrist because 2 before 3 or over 3 is the fraction 2/3, and it yields the decimal 0.666. So now we are going to look at the hidden structure of Daniel chapter number 8. And this is how he sealed up the prophecy. And the prophecy tells us that the abomination of desolation for the holy martyrs will be the Antichrist. But the Antichrist will be defeated by Mary's Rosary. Now I've already pointed out the first and the last verses which mark off the Chiasmus, and also the middle verses, 3 on this side and 3 on this side. Notice again that Antichrist fraction, the 2 over 3, the 2 over 3. And of course we know 2/3 yields the decimal 0.666. Now this is not a strict chiasmus. In a strict chiasmus there is perfect balance. But as we go through these verses you will see that is not the case. Now the first 2 verses are an introduction, and then there is a section which describes a war between the goat and the ram, and I won't go into that on this program. That is simply a retelling of the same battle we see in the book of Revelation between the whore of Babylon and the scarlet beast. The 2 horns on the ram symbolize Britain and America. The single horn on the goat symbolizes Russia. And as we know, decadent capitalism will be defeated by communism in World War III. Following these 6 verses, notice that number, there are 5 verses, which is Mary's Rosary number, which describe the Antichrist. And then there is a concluding verse, verse number 14, which is the bridge verse. And on this side we see the same set, but not quite. We have the opening 5 verses, which correspond to these 5 verses. And then there are 3 verses wherein the angel explains the ram-goat war, 3 verses where the angel explains the Antichrist, and 2 concluding verses. Now, strictly speaking, this is not a true chiasmus, because if it were, these verses would be reversed, and Daniel would put the verses explaining the Antichrist first, and those explaining the ram-goat war last. And so the overall pattern of Daniel chapter number 8 should be fairly obvious. These lines of demarcation mark off where Daniel changes the subject. And of course, it's fairly obvious that 6 verses are followed by 5 verses on each side. 6 verses followed by 5 verses. And of course, once again, that indicates that the Antichrist, whose number is 6, will be defeated by Mary, whose number is 5. That is the same prophecy we find Jesus gives in the Olivet Discourse. That is the same prophecy that Ezekiel gives in his chapter number 29. So, for all of you who are on the fence, you can get a free rosary on the internet. Just Google free rosary. There are many videos on YouTube that explain how to pray the rosary. It would be much wiser for you to learn how to defeat the Antichrist before he comes on the scene, because it will be very horrible after he comes on the scene. It will be very difficult for you to take up the weapons which Jesus wants you to use against the Prince of Darkness. And as always, I do offer a free copy of my book, Revelation Unraveled. If you are interested, you can write to the address you see on your screen or send me a private message to my YouTube channel.